Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar of the Blockchain Research Institute. Um I'm Don Tapscott. I'm the executive chairman and co-founder of the BRI, and we have a big crowd today. A number of people who don't know us or may not be familiar with us, but are interested in learning more. We're, I guess, the world's largest think tank investigating blockchain technologies and how these technologies are part of a broader sort of second era of the digital age. Our focus is not so much about crypto, but it's on how these technologies transform business and government. And today, the discussion is on how trivergence, a term that we've coined, the convergence of blockchain, the Internet of Value, as we call it, artificial intelligence, um, and the Internet of Things is affecting defense. And it's being applied to cyber warfare, cybersecurity, and we'll be exploring how these emerging technologies are paving the way for what could be called military 4.0. We have a couple of awesome panelists, and I'm anxious to get into it, but just a couple of words of introduction. First, there is a requirement, a demand pull for more secure and sophisticated systems. During the pandemic, we've had a cyber attack pandemic. Infrastructure attacks are shutting down pipelines. And 2 weeks ago, one of the most pervasive ransomware attacks occurred ever, the hack of a software company called Cassia. And that allowed a ransomware group to infect more than 1,500 organizations just last week. And there are big geopolitical implications, as many of these attacks are from Russia or other Soviet bloc companies. And of course, 2 days ago, the White House and other allies have accused China of teaming up with some criminal gangs to commit widespread cyber attacks, including one on Microsoft that affected thousands of organizations. And so I think we can all agree that we should have a world of peace. And um, the famous song, "War, what is it good for?" But I think that for the foreseeable future in human history, there's going to be a need for countries, and what we care about is freedom-abiding countries to be able to defend themselves. And so while war is changing, it's not just nation states versus each other, even regions versus each other as in the past. And we have terrorism and new forms of combat. Big wars still will occur and are something to be avoided if we can. And I've just finished a book by Graham Allison called Designed for or Destined for War. China and the United States are headed towards a war that neither of them wants, and the reason is this famous sort of Greek mythology trap, where you have a deadly pattern of structural stress that results in a rising power challenging the ruling one, and God forbid something like that happen, but clearly there's a need for more security, better defense, and new, fresh thinking about how we can have a secure and peaceful world. And on the other hand, we have a technology push that's coming about because of the trivergence. So we've had the first era of information technology, mainframes, mini computers, PCs, the internet, the web, mobile web, the social media, the cloud, big data, and so on. And with those, we started to see computer systems making their way into battlefields and into defense planning and logistics and so on. But now we have this second era centered around the trivergence, where we have AI and technologies that analyze and learn from an enormous amount of data, and the fact that can learn to do things that they weren't programmed to do. We have blockchain, which is the Internet of Value, a platform where value can be managed, stored, communicated, transacted peer to peer. And trust is not achieved by a middleman, but it's achieved by cryptography and collaboration and some clever code. And it the trust is not just between humans, but it can be between things too. So the physical world is becoming smart and it's interconnected as we have billions and trillions of inert objects that become smart communicating devices. So, and this all gets applied to the world of defense. So, in terms, there have been embedded system, machine intelligence, smart devices, and so on. So, creating an opportunity for a more secure world. And today we're going to explore that. And we can imagine that in the future, combatants will rely less on human soldiers and more on divergence technologies to appear or to achieve superior defense capabilities. So let me just introduce our two panelists. We've got a lot of turf to cover here. First is our good friend, retired Colonel James Allen Reginor, Jim. It's great to have you here. The BRI has been working with Jim for some time now, and he's a great collaborator and partner. Jim goes back. He's got 31 years of operational assignments in the Air Force. He's a colonel in the United States Air Force, and he commanded at the group and squadron levels, and he held positions on the joint staff, the air staff, the strategic command staffs. And additionally, he did serve in the White House as executive officer of the president, deputy executive secretary of National Security Council for both Bush and Obama administrations. Welcome, Jim. Jim, by the way, now is a serial entrepreneur as well. And he's involved in the digital transformation of not just airspace, but applying this more broadly to medical and other industry verticals. Veritex for B2B supply chain interactions needed to power the so-called Industry 4.0 across aircraft, medical, and I guess industrial verticals. Retired Brigadier General Blaine Holt, as long and distinguished a career in the U.S. military, where he was spangled in recognition from very early on. He was commander of the U.S. Air Force and orchestrated one of the DoD's most complex logistic operations. He was leading the logistics of the Afghan surge while restoring the Kyrgyz Republic to stability in the wake of a bloody insurrection. And he earned a bunch of medals for that, and also a fellowship to the Council on Foreign Relations. Blaine served as the second highest ranking U.S. military officer at NATO, where he represented the U.S. in negotiations with the alliance. And he now, too, is in the private sector, trying to make a civilian impact and build a successful business. And today he's the CEO of Alchemy, a cutting edge AL, ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning company focused on advanced tools to repair and harden Fortune 500 supply chains. So, gentlemen, welcome. So, please turn on your videos and you can join us. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
So let's get at it. Why don't we start with the whole issue of cyber attacks? This is obviously a huge problem, as I mentioned. And first of all, before we talk about solutions, could each of you just comment on how you view the problem? There's been some high-profile attacks. You want to mention any of those? And could we come up with a sort of category or a taxonomy of threats to be able to think about this in a more structured way? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Don.
It's not often the colonel goes before the general, so I much appreciate it. So, especially with Blano, I just teased. So, hey, Don, a very salient point about cyber. What we're talking about is really a domain that's I'll say relatively new in exploitation. When we talk about domains in the military, we're talking about air, land, sea, cyberspace, and then now space. And when we start thinking about cyber attacks, it's an attack, and we have our enemies every day probing our different infrastructure, our different systems to see where there's weakness, to be able to insert data, corrupt data, exploit, and so on. So it happens 24/7, and it's happening every day. So what's interesting is kind of the framework that we're starting to look at these types of environments. And a term was coined at the Army War College called VUCA, which is really volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And all those descriptors really lay out kind of what that cyberspace looks like today. And the people that are attacking aren't just governments, but they're also government-sanctioned organizations, as you mentioned before. They could be a business, it could be a hacker, it could be a mafia, it could be all sorts of things. But governments are sanctioning these organizations either passively by letting them do it unabetted, or actively by actually encouraging them to do it. So as we look at this cyberspace, we have to look at kind of the characterization of the enemy. And I don't like to use the term enemy, quite frankly. It's really a competition. The world is in this great competition now, whether it's about control, about technology, influence. So we're competing really with kind of a China-Russia bloc against the U.S., and we have to understand what that looks like. At the end of the day, I don't think China and Russia want to annihilate the United States and wipe it off the map. That doesn't make sense because we're too interrelated. But they want to be able to exert influence. They want to be able to extract material, data, raw materials, and shape, kind of what the thought is globally. And technology is allowing them to do that. Cyberspace is the venue where these wars are taking place, or the domain. And I'll pause there for a moment.
I might share a little story with you. First off, it's just wonderful to be here, and I'm honored to be on this panel with you. But I will share a story from my career when I was doing Track 2 diplomacy work with the Chinese. And in that dialogue, which, by the way, Henry Kissinger attended, next to me was my counterpart, a Chinese PLA general, who I kind of put on the dime by saying, hey, what can you tell us about this interview with the LA Times where you said you could wipe out the Western United States with nuclear weapons? It doesn't sound like very responsible diplomacy to me. And he looked at me and he smiled and laughed. And he said, there's no other way to get in the paper. and I said, it's not helpful. And I've got a lot of background with China. I will say that in these cultures, you're less likely to find a hard definition of what's war and what's competition. And that gets to the topic, which is cyber a war domain? Is that a business domain? Is it all of the above? What's fair to be in? I think we start looking at cyber threats. The things that leading defense planners are looking at now is a few things. Looking at, what are the forensics if we had a threat? What's the attribution? How do we get at where this came from? And then we have to start considering, what are the offensive capabilities that we have, or the sanctions? And they don't have to be cyber. It doesn't have to be a tit for tat. But what is the cost that's going to be exacted on the adversary that brought this? And then what I found at the Council on Foreign Relations, we discuss this all the time, was you've got a line between industry and government in the United States, and it's starting to blur pretty quickly because we're starting to realize pretty quickly that national security is a lot more than just defending our borders physically. It's about protecting our industry. And so we're seeing that in cyber, the connection and some of the attacks on logistics and supply chains. And so that ventures into another realm called adversarial logistics, but it's the same type of disciplines. And we've got to go find new policies and new ways of working together with industry that make sense for our security.
So for security, what is it about the current technology that's not working? And can you see the Convergence, for example, blockchain, being able to help? Jim, Blaine, either or both of you comment on that?
We'll just flip flop. So I think today's systems there's a lot of porosity. There's a lot of leakage of data. There's a lot of people that will click on things, just on their desktop and open up, and really they're opening up a door into their system. That door then opens up into the logistics pipeline, perhaps into the DoD, as Blaine mentioned. If you work at a defense contractor, now all of a sudden you have a hacker. But you really, I think, to go back to what Blaine said, contextually we have to look at that line between industry and the Department of Defense or the military. And today, the Chinese have stated outright they'd rather steal IP than create it. So they're attacking our defenses at the weakest point, which is outside the gate. So they're able to impact and create an effect by attacking, stealing IP, and gaining the advantage. And it's tough to defend that. Really tough. We find that out every day. So as Blaine mentioned before, defense is one thing. Having a good offense is another. So within that domain, we have to decide what are the offensive tools that we can use in order to inflict or to garner an effect. That effect may be, offensive tools of corrupting data, or sending something that looks like an authentic piece of data or data stream on intellectual property, when in reality we're creating a fault line. You only have to think back to the Succint virus that went around, right? That was definitely there for an effect. So think in those terms. The other thing to look at is it is a clear and present danger today. And I think a lot of people look kind of at this longer game and said, well, things aren't really happening today. No, it's happening today, right now, right here. People are being attacked. Who knows? There could be attackers watching this webinar to figure out, where are some inroads. So go ahead, Blaine.
Yeah, it's probably likely. I think I would look to the Chinese, the two colonels who wrote the very controversial paper in 1999, and we were told they were admonished, but somehow they repaired themselves, and one went up to be a 2-star general and the director of the AMS, the Academy of Military Science there. But the book was called Unrestricted Warfare. And when I was a staff college student in Belgium as an exchange officer with all the other NATO officers and some from around the world, we tore that thing apart the second it came down, because it got back to this concept that everything's in play. Everything is in play. And what unrestricted warfare was really advocating for was, and this is very, very important to the conversation, I think, a strategy. Didn't advocate for technologies at the time. It advocated for a strategy that an enemy, and like the United States, could be defeated in a multi-dimensional, multi-domain area where we were facing cyber attacks, we were facing stuff on our grid, stuff in economic warfare, things in the markets, but all at the same time. And that would be overwhelming. Well, a couple of things happened since 1999. The technologies since then have emerged. All of those enabling technologies that were the dreams of those two colonels are now in play in the world. Now, before we frighten everybody on the call here, those technologies are in play for everybody. And I can promise you that military thinkers in the United States military have absorbed the similar situation. And this is where you get to this kind of standoff, because China, with its global presence, from Africa, the Middle East, Malaccan Straits, and on, they're very globally vulnerable as well. And so the argument for this strategy leaves them also at the end of being vulnerable for that strategy. So again, we're in a race right now to find out how we can nail down attribution and the forensics to be very confident when we say you did it, because that spoofing an attack from a different party, that's where we get into miscalculation. And that's where I think the world has a lot of danger, has a lot of threat, not just A to B tit for tat stuff.
All right. So this is really interesting. So unrestricted warfare has this combat on all fronts, including economic. So you can see the economic will continue. Yeah. Actual battlefield stuff, we want to try and avoid that, right? Ultimately, yeah. We sure want to avoid nuclear. What is your Jim? You weren't clear to me about, or at least maybe I didn't understand your stance about cyber warfare. Like, I guess they're, to be really primitive here, there are kind of two perspectives. One is we're at war and we're going after them using the same stuff, right? And we're going to attack them in every way that we can. The other is that we say diplomatically, from the diplomacy point of view, no, just like battlefield combat, this is an area of combat that we should avoid because it's not good for either of us. And we're gonna identify and validate what you have done, but we're not going to behave in the same activity. I mean, that may be naive. What do you guys think?
So Don, go back to how wars were fought after World War II between the U.S. and Russia. They were fought via surrogates, right? So whether it's North Vietnam, South Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea, and so on. So we had all these surrogates, one fighting for communists, one fighting for our side. The same thing I think holds true today in the cyberspace. When I mention unsanctioned actors, I'm talking about really using surrogates, whether it's a surrogate Russian hacking organization or so on. It's not by circumstance. I think that Putin and Biden talked about, hey, you got to stop hacking, and then Putin goes back to Russia, and next thing you know, we have this big hacking attack. So I think people are trying to establish where the line is. Where is the line? On the battlefield, it's called the forward edge of the battle area, right? The FIBA. So where's that in the cyberspace? I don't think we've gotten there yet. On a governmental level, I think you could talk to many corporations and companies, and they'd say, no, we've already crossed that line. So really establishing that. The other thing is you have to establish a defensible position. So if you think in terms of water rivers and the role they played in the creation of society, modern society, society, commerce, and government sprung up around rivers. Why? Rivers were good borders. They're defensible. You can blow a bridge or keep people from talking. You have a choke point where somebody has to come across that bridge to attack you and so on. In today's terms, those bridges are digital. Those rivers are digital, and the bridges are many. They're APIs and so on. So how do you work in that environment where you have a river that really has no set path day to day? It's just data flowing everywhere. It's extremely difficult, and that's why it goes into that VUCA environment that I mentioned before. But having tools and then the wherewithal to use those tools on an offensive scale is really what we have to get to. And I'll tell you, on the defensive side, the technologies we're speaking of today, AI and blockchain, are some of the tools that we can use on the defensive side. And I'll pause there for Blaine.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And on the battlefield, if I go really tactical, which I like to stay at the strategic, but on the tactical battlefield, a zero trust environment could not be more important now than ever. And the reason that's so is because, getting back to what I was talking about, spoofing. Commanders have to have a high degree of confidence that their decisions are based on data that is accurate and correct. And platforms out there now that some of them are unmanned and more are going to be unmanned on the battlefield, those can become the weapons you're fighting in 5 seconds if you don't have provenance on the battlefield about what you're doing. The other part is you're looking at a whole new level of robotics with voice replication, face replication, and all of those types of visual things. And blockchain technology, I believe, is going to be the path to defending ourselves and then having confidence in a battle environment that the plan is proceeding and we have confidence that it's proceeding the way that we thought it would.
All right, so let's get into that and talk about battle. Mm-hmm. Actually, before I do that, your story about your Chinese counterpart, this is a good way to get in the newspaper. It reminded me the first time I met Colin Powell was many years ago, just after Glasnost. And he told this story that Gorbachev had approached him, and he had a conversation. Gorbachev said, look, this whole Cold War thing is just not working for us. We got to end it. And we got to move to a whole new paradigm in terms of our relationship. And Colin Powell says his first reaction was, what are you talking about? I love the Cold War. You're a great enemy. Things are really clear here. You're a wonderful enemy. We get lots of funding because of you. Don't mess up a good thing. So anyway.
That's the brutal truth. Yeah, that's the brutal truth.
It's a machine. It's a machine, and it has to keep on grinding. I mean, just think of a peaceful world. We'd have a lot of people that work in the military-industrial complex searching for other things to do.
Well, ultimately, that might be a good thing. Hopefully, we can achieve that. Okay, so military 4.0. This is a term that I've heard both of you use. I don't think it's a well-established term. What are you referring to there?
So I'll take this. You've got Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution. You've got the defense industrial base, military planners that have just basically paralleled right up to that term. So military 4.0, here we are. We're going to do a whole new set of, assets on the battlefield, assets in the water, all source intelligence, space, and these are the things that make defense companies light up with glee because the contracts will come. I don't look at it that way. I look at it from more of a strategy formulation point. And I think really to dust off our Ray Kurzweil book and the singularity is near, we should understand that we're at, I like your term, the trivergence. It's really excellent because we are at an intersection where these technologies are maturing, not in an evolutionary sense. They're maturing rapidly, exponentially. And the human tissue in military 4.0 is the weak link here because we've got to be able to prioritize and understand what these things are. We've got to be able to see what our strategy is and if it's even still relevant. And then we've got to go ahead and fit those things into it so that it's coherent, it makes sense. And, military planners and strategists today have never had a greater challenge than they do right now because of the things that we're seeing. How hard would it be to sit there and say, well, I want this super molecular vaporizer that is hanging off of this jet and it's going to be the greatest thing ever, only to find out that it's obsolete in the afternoon because guess who was listening to your conversation and they just dusted off, the anti-molecular vaporizer. But that's where 4.0 is. It should signify to everybody, this is a complex world. This is a thinking person's world, and it has no borders on domains. And domains is not just air, land, and sea. They go out to economy, your supply chains, the air you breathe, the water you drink.
Yeah. So to piggyback on what Blaine said, the other thing to consider is the cadence or tempo of warfare has changed in this industry 4.0. When you go in the Air Operations Center and you now have 20 Predator feeds up flying and other ISR, so which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets flying, you have to have some way to funnel all that down. We don't need more information. We need more knowledge out of the information we're getting in Industry 4.0 to help us make these decisions. And that's where the tools like machine learning and AI will come together and help us in our decision matrices. That will then result in an increased cadence or increased tempo. We use a 72-hour cycle in the air planning or the air tasking order. That needs to really be compressed in order to operate in this industry. The other thing to consider, I think, is when we look at kind of where the adversary is and their ability to, as I mentioned before, to continually, constantly probe and move in. Zones or areas of conflict during peacetime usually happen in what's called ungoverned spaces, whether it's in Somalia, the tri-border region in South America, or failed states like the Sudan and other places. That's where you have the kind of this convergence of bad actors that then reach out and strike, whether it was Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and so on. I would go back to, as was mentioned before, the cyberspace or the internet or whatever is an ungoverned space for all intents and purposes. So we have to find some way to put governance in there. Governance then would lead to retribution if somebody violates what that governance is, what those laws, what those rules are. But we have to find some way in this internet of value, Don, is to establish governance in data, governance in behavior, and so on. Because it's one thing to strike back at a system, it's another thing to strike back at a person. In the way that you strike back at people, the U.S. Department of Treasury is pretty good about it. They go in and they put sanctions on your bank account, your ability to move money or cash, and next thing you know, nobody wants to talk to you if you're a billionaire and oligarch. So, we've got those tools down. We just need to be able to, as Blaine alluded to earlier, get that forensics path back. But that's what Industry 4.0 is going to be about: increased cadence and increased knowledge on the data that we're getting today to help with our decision matrices. I'll pause there.
So you're using the term Industry 4.0. So if I get that right, just for those who have not been following this, the first industrial age was electricity, actually steam, and that enabled things like we mechanized things like hoes and shovels. Then the second was electricity, and the main impact of that was the industrialization, the creation of industrial production. The third was the computer, and mainframes and minis and PCs and all that stuff that I went through. And the fourth is the Trivergence, a new generation of technologies, as I described it. So applied to the military world, I'm sure there are analogies for each of those stages on how the military operated as well. But now we're moving into a new period where, in the future, we're not relying so much on human soldiers, but on these diverging technologies to achieve superior kind of defense capabilities. Is that the idea, Jim?
Yeah. So Don, look at just to kind of use analogies. We went from being able to shoot things with bows and arrows and spears, and then guns and Gatling guns. If you think in modern warfare, we went from carpet bombing in World War II to precision in Vietnam to surgical strike now. Surgical strike is we're worried about the guy standing next to the bad guy that we're about to go after, or so on. We don't want to hurt the person next to them. They're non-combatant and so on. So we've really necked this down into this more surgical, more fine-tuned type of environment, and it's difficult to work in that environment. We're used to go out and cast a net when now we have to fish with a hook, and I think that's what you're starting to see. What's essential to us in what you mentioned before is being able to pull out trends, patterns, or anomalies when we start looking at these data sets. And when you go back and look at these different, the different four revolutions, we're to the point now where knowledge is being generated. So let's just go from Industry 3.0 to Industry 4.0. It's really that knowledge that's being generated out of those patterns, out of those trends that we can start to put together and start to educate our machines, our equipment, and our soldiers. Our soldiers are sensors now. There was an ad put out by the DoD this past week. They're looking for somebody to make a graphene antenna that's wearable. So why? Because they're going to put it on a soldier. They want it built right into his uniform and so on. So the soldier now becomes a sensor. How fast can I get relevant data into the IVOS system, which is this HoloLens that the Army is buying several million copies of? How fast can I get that data in? How fast can I allow that soldier to look around the building and see what's on the other side and so on? So that's really where this Trivergence is coming to. And then the most important part is, how do I maintain data integrity through all these systems that I'm pushing? And that, to me, is where the blockchain, in our case, the blockchain comes into play, is really how do I filter out dirty data? And two, how do I provide that data integrity stream all the way down to the soldiers so that they can act on it? I'll pause there.
Hold that thought, because that's a big one. We're going to come back. But Blaine, did you want to comment on military? Also, we have there's a term in military spheres called the Internet of Battle Things. I think you guys have been referring to the Internet of Battlefield Things. You guys have been referring to the battlefield of things. I guess it's a short form of that, but I'm sure it's what it sounds like. But do you want to comment on this?
Yeah. So again, it gets back to, we've really widened the scope out, but about what is the battlefield? It's not just a site sitting in Afghanistan where we're going to go drop some bombs and see some technologies move around with some people. It's everything, and it's all domains. And so I think it's interesting because Jim and I have an operational background in heavy aircraft logistics, flying jets around the world. And we've grown up in this with these technologies. And here we are in our civilian roles, maybe perhaps taking a step back off of the battlefield of things, but being very much a part of the security piece and this battlefield with our respective companies. So you've got Veritex, which has got supply chain or provenance in the blockchain coming to aerospace companies. And honestly, we've got to protect that. That's a national security imperative. And up at Alchemy, we're leveraging AI, ML, and data science to not just enable companies to repair and harden their supply chains. What I owe the government, what I owe defense industrial base contractors is is something to help them get through adversarial logistics, because part of this battlefield now is country X finds a supplier 5 tiers down in your chain, and it might just be something little like a microchip. And we've seen those stories. And they buy the company and destroy the company and sell it all. And now you're in real trouble. So network interdependencies and cascading risk. If you were to talk your Trivergence, Don, I would say cascading risk is right at the center of that across all of it. And it's not just one Jenga block. You can't solve for that anymore. You got the entire thing, and they all relate to each other. And so it's not just the tech, it's also the humans using it, and it's whether they're non-state or state, what the intent is, and then the provenance and the forensics to understand, yes, that's where it came from. And now we can start developing courses of action.
Okay, so both of you have talked about cyber defense through this Trivergence. So let's focus a bit on blockchain, if we could. How can blockchain, protect vulnerable logistics and data? And how could it, help fortify government infrastructure like telecommunications, water, food supply, energy, and so on, which right now is being hacked, held to ransom, and so on?
So I'll take a stab at this, Don, since it's Veritex's business. So when we look at this, Don, when we look at, we'll kind of attack from the logistics side, which will be, as Blaine mentioned, to all different elements. But the Air Force has a framework, or the DoD has a framework now, which is called LUA, Logistics Under Attack. So they're building systems, understanding that system, one, has vulnerabilities, and two, there's a competitor that's trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. So how then does blockchain work? I think the simplest way to explain blockchain is looking at different integrities, whether it's a data integrity, a process integrity, or even a performance integrity on the battlefield. But using those tools, as we know, often when one of these organizations is breached, it's a result of many months of work to figure out, hey, we were breached. There's not an alarm that goes off that says somebody penetrated us. It's typically, take a bank. Somebody finds their information on the dark web, calls our bank up and says, hey, my information's on the dark web. Why is it there? And the bank goes, ooh, let's look. They go, oh yeah, 6 months ago we had a breach. We didn't know about it. Well, as you know, Don, when you're using blockchain, if somebody goes in and changes something within the block itself, it changes the hash. So next thing you know is you have an indicator, a real-time indicator to tell you, hey, something's going on. That's what's missing today. That's why these new technologies will help advance. So it'll provide that data integrity. The other thing to look at is decentralizations of the network. So blockchain working in a decentralized network is very important when you look at denial of service attacks and so on. The Estonians in 2007 had a denial of service attack by the Russians. It shut the whole government of Estonia down. After that, they invented or used or utilized distributed ledger technology long before the block word became the nom de jure. And out of that, they established what's called digital embassies. They took all the important documents for the country of Estonia to operate, and they created a node in each one of their embassies worldwide. So by using this decentralized or distributed system, they were able to prevent that sort of attack and to fortify the pipe. So when we look at what the battlefield looks like, why blockchain can help, one, we can do things with encryption by tokenizing individual data elements, using key pairing. We can use verifiable identification. We can use smart contracts with prescribed data flow in it with verifiable identification and key sets to fortify that. So we can do a lot more structurally with the data packs to fortify it. And then if somebody penetrates, we get an indication right away. To me, that's the most valuable aspect of blockchain coming to this new, as I mentioned before, this new environment that's, the VUCA environment. I'll pause there.
I think that's a great point. I view, because we're not core blockchain, we're using big data and AI and ML. Blockchain to me is like a backbone, and it's got to be there in the atmosphere to operate effectively. When you're doing data science, you're offering probabilistic solutions. You're offering statistical-based solutions. I can bring in feeds to a customer from not just their own data, but geopolitical data, news scrapes, public sentiment scrapes. I can bring in ESG, zero supply chain waste, commodities pricing. I can bring all that. However, along the way, can somebody get in that chain and manipulate that data? And then does that take the error bar, error is human, does that take the error bar and then widen it out as you're looking at probabilistic decision grade information, which is what customers, both military and civilian, want, is decision. It's interesting to see the commodities prices, but it doesn't do anything for you. So you want to have smart algorithms prosecuting these things all at one time in a very smart way so that you have decision grade information, and that'll serve everybody well. But from my viewpoint, it's that blockchain environment that's the galvanizer. It's that provenance that has to be a part of the equation so that the probabilities are correct.
And the biggest risk to you, Blaine, quite frankly, is dirty data, right?
Yeah.
Or corrupted data, right? So without that data integrity rail running across.
We solved that. We solved that. That's not a risk to us.
No, it's not a risk to you because we've partnered together. But
that's right.
But really, that is the risk within the ecosystem. And now extend that into, the Joint Forces Air Component Commander, or the Joint Forces Commander. He's got to know that his data can be trusted, Don. It has to happen in order for him to prosecute the war. And it becomes a much bigger problem when you start bringing in foreign countries, you start bringing in defense contractors. When you're in an air operations center, there's people from, as I mentioned, there's liaison officers from other countries. There's also liaison officers from corporations that are providing different technologies and so on. And that's just in the normal warfare. You get into the special access programs, and it's crazy what's going on in that environment. And data integrity fundamentally must be 100% guaranteed. And today it's not.
All right.
But with the tools we have with blockchain.
Okay, so this is really getting at the heart of the matter. That when you think about battle, war, and the role of blockchain, it's not just blockchain in the theater. I mean, I think some people might think, blockchain in combat. So I guess your flashlight, when it runs out of the battery, gets low, it orders a new battery or so on a distributed ledger, or more sensibly, you have blockchain for secure communications and movement of digital assets and stuff, which is sensible in a battlefield. But if you think about multi-domain operations, and one of them being that there's an economic battle or competition, Jim, as you used the term. And ultimately, if we can create a more secure environment, co-opetition, as no country can succeed in a world that's failing or when there's a constant sort of battle going on. But I think that you have to think about that defense is not just about war, it's about the economy. And I remember the first Bill Clinton campaign, they said it's the economy's stupid. And maybe when it comes to defense, it's the same thing. It's the economy's stupid. Creating a secure economy, a secure supply chain, secure infrastructure, secure research facilities, secure basic domestic and international government operations. And blockchain is absolutely the infrastructure to do that everywhere. I mean, did I get that right? Or would you?
That's what we've been trying to convince the DoD of. And the DoD has a huge undertaking. They're trying to modernize right now, right? So they're coming up with what they're calling data fabrics. They're coming up with, on the logistics side, depot of the future, and so on. But really on the battle space side too, there's quite a bit of modernization, quite a bit of technology insertion that's taking place. What we want to do though, and the trap is chasing the shiny penny, Don. So we need to take an effects-based approach. We need to decide what is the effect that we're after, what technology then will yield that effect. And I'll defer to Blaine because he's passionate about this.
Yeah, I think everything starts with strategy. And when I was the director of logistics for the European theater, I would have a lot of folks coming in to sell products, as you might imagine, and wanting to sell their wares. But it was always about the tech. It was always about what's the widget. What it wasn't about was what is the strategy? What are we trying to accomplish here at the big glossy thing? And when you get to geopolitical strategy, you should look at the world and basically tectonic plates that are moving all over the place all the time. And what's most important about starting to formulate a strategy is to figure out what the other guy's strategy is. And I take you well that co-opetition is where we want to be. that is absolutely the safest environment for the global commons. There's no question about that.
Right.
But at the other end of that spectrum, there's this really dangerous place called, it's not enough that I succeed, but you must also fail.
Right.
And on that spectrum, I worry that great power competition seems to be moving back down to the bad place, not to the good place.
Yeah.
And what I think is always going to be promoting us to get more over to the coopetition side is going to be these emerging technologies that provide provenance. And it doesn't just have to be blockchain. You can lay quantitative encryption over the top of that. You can overlay a lot of different things. And Jim got on something very interesting earlier, governance in the internet. I don't know how hard over I am on that one, because there's always going to be a missing element, or it at least has to be solved for. And that is enforcement and accountability. So I'm all for governance. I'm all for a rules-based system. But what we've lacked in the past 20 years is governance and accountability to say, aha, I see you messed up, you broke the rules, and here's what happens perfunctorily rather than emotionally on the diplomatic stage. And with smart contracts, there's a variety of ways that we can get at that we can actually now verify the intellectual property is actually owned by the sender. We can verify that via the smart contract that actually you did play by the rules on that treaty and you fished that fish in the right spot. We're going to be just fine. And so those are the ways to use these technologies, I think, to move more down to the coopetition side of the equation rather than where I see us drifting right now.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, so
that's really,
you bring up a very good point, and a smart man once told me that's a little sunlight. That was Don Tapscott's quote. But what you're saying is, these will allow us.
We lost you on the internet,
So,
but I think sunlight is the best disinfectant.
It is.
yeah, best disinfectant. I said antiseptic. Yeah. So, but shining that light is really, as I mentioned, these ungoverned spaces. The reason why you can't hide in Sudan anymore is because there's government and so on. So when you can put governance in these ungoverned spaces and keep people accountable, that's when you can again create light and get rid of some of these bad actors. I'll pause there. Go ahead.
Well, and a good point about the shiny things too. I guess we're referring to where things are doing a lot of the fighting rather than humans. But also, it's exciting to imagine when you have human shoulders soldiers, that there's smart technologies you were alluding to in their armor and their weapons and other objects that give them a better sort of situational understanding. You might even call it sort of a extrasensory perception, and providing fighters with predictive powers and where they can have better risk assessment, even kind of shared intuitions. But and that's all super shiny. But beyond that, there's the really big stuff about how do we actually defend ourselves, given that that's not just what war is about anymore. I wanted to just pick up the governance thing, Blaine, that you mentioned, because if you look at the governance of the internet, and we've done a lot of work on this at the Blockchain Research Institute, also how blockchain is governed, that this was done largely through multi-stakeholder networks, not nation states. The DoD gave this up, the ARPANET, a long time ago, and it was a good thing that they did. But you have standards groups like the Internet Engineering Task Force that develops standards, W3C Consortium for the Web. You have policy groups like the Internet Governance Forum. There are operational groups like ICANN that just, give out domain names or knowledge networks like the Internet Society. There are advocacy groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But when it comes to enforcement, you really need nation states, because as much as maybe we'd like to see a world without them, for now, they're the ones that have a monopoly over military force, and that have the muscle to be able to ensure that agreements are enforced and that people abide by their commitments. I mean, is that kind of what you were getting at?
I am, and I would also extend that to international bodies where you have signatories to a multinational treaty or some organizational mechanism. I would also stretch that out to the governance on the private sector side. That my view is that there are ways in smart contracts to actually latch accountability faults to. And so in an Ethereum or a Cardano contract, I love Cardano because I'm thinking about Africa every single day. But in a smart contract environment like this, it's perfectly reasonable for you to sign terms on the contract that says lack of performance equals this, theft of intellectual property equals this. There's always going to be an arbiter. You could do that with a third-party arbitration. You could do that in a common court. But it seems to me that it's much more efficient and less costly for business to have the carrots and the sticks defined right up front. And that's why I love some of the disintermediation that's happening in the food supply chain in Africa, in African countries. You're seeing blockchain being used very effectively in certain countries where farm to table corruption is coming out of the transaction space, and that's an exciting place to be. But it also can send a message to certain adversaries in the world that when we promote things like that, if the entire domanosphere is a battlefield, well, we can play there too, and we can be quite effectively at it to get our diplomatic ends.
And it also opens up opportunities for countries that wouldn't be normally considered a competitor, that aren't a major world power, and having kind of the tools. It's kind of like basketball. You can be a small school with 5 great players and end up in a finals, and it didn't take a lot. You didn't have to become Duke or somewhere to get there. The same holds true. So shaping behavior of smart contracts works really well in the commercial side. If your payments are on time, your quality's good, you get a net 30, or you get a net 15, or maybe you get a minus 15. If you're really, really doing poor, you get a net 60, or you get pushed out. So, and then you can curate it. You can say you're a 1, 2, 3, 4-star type of supplier. So there's a curation that can take place. The same thing could extend into this space with between nations, right? And hey, if you're good, you can have X, Y, and Z. So that, I think, is a very good application, especially when we look at what I'll call economic treaties, economic governance. I think that holds true. I'm going to pause there because give the last words to Don here as we wrap up.
Just before we go to last words, I did want to ask one more question, which is the sort of dark side of all of this. I mean, you start to see technologies that learn to do things that they weren't programmed to do, and that are very, very capable and aren't. What's the danger of creating Skynet from the Terminator? I mean, am I going to have to look out the window here and there's an armed drone making sure that I don't say anything against the government? That's a bit futuristic and far-fetched, honestly. But are there real dangers here? And if so, how do we govern all of this to ensure that doesn't occur?
Jim?
All right, so I'll go back real quick. You got to create with a conscience and try to instill that conscience and a set of ethics and a set of morals into what you're doing. And hopefully that the machine learning and the AI actually can start to understand. But it becomes an if-then statement, right? It's not as easy as a human as far as reasoning goes. So I think it's critical, Don. I think that we could get to a point where there is a rogue device, perhaps, on a network, and it's acting out. So there has to be a means to, 1, to identify it's acting out, and 2, a means to go in and take it out of that network, to unplug it, so to speak, so that it can't go. But I do think it's a threat. There's a lot of pundits out there talking right now that the destruction of the earth is going to come at the hands of AI and so on. I don't think so, because it's man that's actually controlling that on-off switch, at least for now. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think it's human tissue, right? We need humanity. We're not going to replace diplomats, heads of state, militaries, and all of that. What we do need is more provenance to move us more towards the coopetition line, so that more can understand why it's in their best interest not to just turn loose a Skynet. I absolutely understand military thinkers who are adversaries to us. If it's possible to develop, they're going to develop it. It will be in reality. It's not going to be held back. So then we as human beings have to create carrots and sticks, the age-old craft of diplomacy, the age-old craft of military deterrence, and now teaching our corporate partners how to do the same types of things, so that we don't envision a world where we head down that pike.
Well put. Let me just throw it out to you, 30 seconds to each of you. Big picture. Given all of this, we want to create a more secure, safe, and ultimately peaceful world where there's prosperity for everyone. What should leaders in the defense establishment be thinking about today? What is to be done going forward?
Blaine, you want to start or you want to end?
Well, a simple little question here.
I'll end like a broken record where I end up every single time, which is strategy.
Yeah.
Live there. Live in the long term. Stop looking at today. Stop looking at next year. Look at strategy. What is it that our grand national strategy is trying to achieve? What do we envision? And then let's back it all up from those outcomes and see what it takes to walk down that path, chart the path, and leverage what we have before us right now, what's on the drafting table for tomorrow, and sync those things up in a smart way. And let's be very watchful of that spectrum of coopetition versus the dark place. And that those would be my closing thoughts.
And I would echo the same and add that we need to understand the context that we're living in right now in that VUCA environment. And we need to take the data that we're getting and actually create knowledgeable that leads to actionable, more informed decisions, because that's where accidents happen. That's where all of a sudden we could cross that line. And the other thing is, we need to stick to, we still need to care about ethics and morals and so on. We can't get so, we can't allow technology to drive us away from what our background is, in the fact that all human life is important, and we need to learn how to live in a world where there is competition, and there is a such thing as friendly competition, not destructive competition. And I think we can all make inroads to that space by leveraging, as I said, the accountability factors, as Blaine mentioned and I mentioned. I'll pause there, though. I appreciate you giving us the time to pontificate on this, Don. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much. And Jim, as you know, you'll be involved, or love to involve you too, in doing some writing about this issue, trying to take it to the next level. We'll also be posting information about Veritix, Jim and Alchemy, Blaine, for people who want to follow up directly with you. I'm sort of reminded of that old aphorism that the future is not something to be predicted, it's something to be achieved. And let's face it, the world is a very troubled place right now. It's too unstable, it's too conflicted, unsustainable. And it's going to take a lot of collective will to make this happen. Thankfully, we have this new generation of technology, Convergence, that can help us perhaps ensure that this smaller world that our grandchildren inherit is actually a better one. But ultimately, I agree. It's humans that create institutions, and that create peace, and that create security, not technology. And so it really falls on us as leaders to bring our values and our legitimate expectations and our sense of what is right to the table to ensure that that this new world is a better one. So again, thanks so much. Fascinating conversation. Everyone, stay tuned to blockchainresearchinstitute.org for more webinars and more research that we're releasing into the public domain. So long for now.
See you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.